For decades after the Civil War, a single myth attached itself to one man and never let go. The idea that if James Longstreet had simply moved faster on the afternoon of July 2, 1863, the Confederacy might have won at Gettysburg, might have won the war itself. Robert E. Lee called him his old war horse, his most trusted corps commander. And for the rest of his life, Longstreet carried the blame for a defeat that history simplified into one word: slow. The real story is far more damning than that, and far more interesting. It is a story about 9 separate decisions made across 3 days by a general operating under pressures almost nobody talks about. Decisions that compounded until the Confederacy's best chance at Gettysburg had quietly slipped away. This is that story, told in full, the way it actually happened. To understand why these 9 moments matter, it helps to understand who James Longstreet actually was before Gettysburg. Because the general who arrived in Pennsylvania in the summer of 1863 was not a cautious man by reputation. He had proven himself repeatedly as one of the most reliable combat commanders in either army, holding the Confederate right at 2nd Manassas with a coordinated counterattack that historians still study, and directing the devastating defense at Fredericksburg that had made Ambrose Burnside's assaults so catastrophically pointless. Lee did not choose Longstreet as his senior corps commander by accident. He chose him because Longstreet's judgment on the battlefield had, up to that point, been consistently sound. That track record is exactly what makes the decisions at Gettysburg worth examining in detail rather than dismissing with a single word. Something changed in how Longstreet operated over those 3 days, and understanding what changed means walking through each decision in the order it actually happened. The stakes at Gettysburg were higher than at almost any other engagement of the war, and both armies understood it at the time. Lee had crossed into Pennsylvania, hoping a decisive Confederate victory on northern soil might finally force a negotiated peace, strengthen the position of peace Democrats in the North, and potentially draw European recognition the Confederacy had been chasing since 1861. A Confederate defeat, by contrast, would end any realistic hope of that outcome and hand the strategic initiative in the Eastern Theater to the Union for the remainder of the war. Every hour, every decision, every division committed or held back over those 3 days carried weight far beyond the immediate tactical situation on the ground around Gettysburg. And that weight sat on every commander involved, Longstreet included, whether they consciously felt it or not. The first mistake happened before a single shot was fired on the second day, and it happened in a conversation most people have never heard the full details of. On the evening of July 1st, 1863, after Confederate forces had driven Union troops back through the town of Gettysburg and onto the high ground south of it, Longstreet rode to Lee's headquarters and argued for something that ran completely against the aggressive instincts Lee had built his entire military reputation on. Longstreet wanted the Army of Northern Virginia to disengage from Gettysburg entirely, march around the Union left flank, position itself between the Army of the Potomac and Washington, and force George Meade to attack a fortified Confederate position instead of the other way around. It was, on paper, a sound strategic concept, drawing on the same defensive logic that had made Fredericksburg such a disaster for the Union 7 months earlier. Lee rejected it. He believed the Union Army was still recovering from the day's fighting. That momentum favored an immediate follow-up assault, and that the high ground the Confederates had failed to seize on July 1st needed to be taken before Meade could fully consolidate his position. Longstreet's mistake here was not that he proposed the flanking movement, it was that once Lee rejected it, Longstreet did not fully commit himself to the alternative plan with the urgency the situation demanded. He continued, over the following hours and into the next morning, to make his disagreement known rather than throwing his complete operational energy into preparing for the attack Lee had actually ordered. That gap between disagreement and commitment would shape everything that followed. There is a version of this story, repeated so often it has calcified into accepted fact, where Longstreet's disagreement with Lee on the evening of July 1st was itself insubordinate, a corps commander refusing to accept his superior's judgment. The actual record does not support that version. Longstreet made his case, Lee heard it, Lee decided otherwise, and by every surviving account, Longstreet then set about preparing to execute Lee's plan. What the record does support is something subtler, and, in its way, more consequential. The argument itself had cost time on an evening when time was already scarce, and the fact that Longstreet continued to believe his own plan superior meant he approached the following day's preparations without the full conviction that had powered his previous performances at 2nd Manassas and Fredericksburg. A general who believes completely in the plan he is executing moves differently than one who is executing a plan he has already argued against. That difference does not show up in any single order or any single hour. It shows up cumulatively across an entire day in 100 small decisions about pace and priority that nobody was writing down at the time. The second mistake compounded the first almost immediately, and it involved a piece of Longstreet's own command that never should have been out of position in the first place. Evander Law's brigade, part of John Bell Hood's division within Longstreet's corps, was stationed roughly 28 miles away near New Guilford, and the order finally came to move toward Gettysburg. Law's men marched through the night and arrived exhausted on the morning of July 2nd, and Longstreet chose to wait for their arrival before beginning his attack rather than launching the assault with the divisions already in position. This decision has generated more argument among historians than almost any other moment in the battle, because reasonable military logic supported waiting. Hood's division needed to be at full strength for the assault Lee had assigned it, but the cost of that logic was measured in hours, and those hours were hours Union Third Corps under Daniel Sickles used to move forward from the position Meade had originally assigned him into an exposed salient around the Peach Orchard. A move that would dramatically reshape the battlefield Longstreet was about to attack. Waiting for Law's brigade was defensible in isolation. Combined with everything else, it was one more piece of time the Confederacy could not afford to spend. What makes this particular delay worth dwelling on is the alternative Longstreet had available and chose not to take. He could have launched Hood's division and McLaws' division forward with the troops already on the field, using Law's brigade as a follow-up force once it arrived, rather than treating the entire assault as contingent on every unit being present simultaneously. This was not an unreasonable choice for a commander trained, as Longstreet was, to value a fully assembled force over a partial one committed piecemeal. But the ground in front of him was changing by the hour. Daniel Sickles' decision to advance the Union Third Corps into the Peach Orchard salient was still developing while Longstreet waited, and every hour spent waiting for Law's exhausted men to arrive was an hour Sickles used to entrench a position that would make the coming assault considerably bloodier than it needed to be. Sickles' advance, which took place independently of anything Longstreet was doing on the other side of the field, created a salient at the Peach Orchard that jutted forward from the main Union line, exposed on both flanks and unsupported by the rest of the Third Corps position Meade had originally intended. Had Longstreet's assault begun even 2 hours earlier, it would have struck a Union left flank that was still essentially where Meade had placed it that morning, anchored more conventionally and without the exposed salient that ended up absorbing so much of the fighting at the wheat field and the Peach Orchard. The Confederate attack that finally went in at 4 o'clock still inflicted enormous damage and very nearly broke the Union line in several places, which raises an uncomfortable question that historians have never fully resolved. What would those same divisions, fresh and coordinated, have accomplished against the position Meade held at 10 in the morning, before Sickles moved and before the day's heat and marching had worn down the attacking Confederate infantry? The third mistake is the one that has done more damage to Longstreet's reputation than any other single event of the battle, and it deserves to be understood in its actual sequence rather than the simplified version that turned into lost cause mythology. As Longstreet's column moved to get into position for the attack, its route would have taken it across open ground visible from a Union signal station on Little Round Top. Rather than risk revealing the Confederate flanking movement to Union observers, Longstreet halted the march and ordered a countermarch, pulling the column back and rerouting it along a path that kept it concealed. The countermarch consumed additional time that the army did not have to spare, and it has been treated for a century and a half as proof of Longstreet's reluctance to fight. What gets left out of that version is that the countermarch was Longstreet's own tactical judgment in the moment, made to preserve the element of surprise Lee's plan depended on, and that abandoning concealment in favor of speed carried its own serious risk. The mistake was not that Longstreet cared about secrecy. The mistake was that nobody in Confederate command had properly reconnoitered the route in advance, which meant the discovery of the exposed ground and the decision about how to handle it were both being made in real time, under pressure, with the clock already working against them. This is worth sitting with, because it reveals something about Confederate staff work at Gettysburg that gets obscured when the countermarch is discussed purely as a Longstreet failure. Reconnaissance of the approach route was, technically, a responsibility shared across the engineering and staff officers assigned to guide the column, not Longstreet's alone. Captain Samuel Johnston, who had scouted the route earlier that morning, either missed the exposure to the signal station or the information never reached Longstreet clearly enough for him to plan around it in advance. What should have been a known obstacle, planned for before the march even began, instead became an emergency decision made mid-movement. Longstreet's countermarch was the correct response to a problem that should never have surprised anyone in the first place, and the hour or more it consumed was the price of that earlier failure in reconnaissance, absorbed by a commander who had no better option once the column was already exposed. It is also worth noting what did not happen as a result of the countermarch, because the counterfactual cuts against the simplest version of the criticism leveled at Longstreet. Had he pushed the column forward along the exposed route rather than rerouting it, Union signal officers on Little Round Top would very likely have spotted the movement and reported it immediately to Meade's headquarters, potentially giving Union commanders enough advance warning to reposition defenses before Longstreet's divisions ever reached their attack positions. The countermarch cost time. Abandoning it might have cost the element of surprise that made the eventual assault as dangerous to the Union line as it was. The fourth mistake was the delay in actually launching the assault once Longstreet's divisions were finally in position. Lee's order had called for an attack as early in the day as practicable, and the standard reading of Confederate military correspondence from that period makes clear that Lee expected the assault to begin in the morning or shortly after. Longstreet's attack did not begin until roughly 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Some of that delay is explained by Law's March and the countermarch already described. But a meaningful portion of it reflects something else, a level of methodical caution in Longstreet's command style that served him well in defensive fighting, where his instincts were consistently excellent throughout the war, and served him poorly in a situation that demanded speed above precision. Longstreet was, by nature and by proven record, a general who preferred to have every element of an attack fully prepared before committing to it. At Gettysburg on July 2nd, that preference cost the Confederacy the morning hours when the Union position on its left flank was still forming and far more vulnerable than it would be by late afternoon. The contrast with Lee's own operational tempo throughout the war is instructive here. Lee had built his reputation on speed, on marching divisions faster than his opponents believed possible, on striking before an enemy had finished consolidating a position. Jackson's Valley Campaign, which Lee had watched unfold with evident approval a year earlier, was built entirely on that principle. Longstreet operated by a different clock. His genius, demonstrated repeatedly across the war, was defensive, the patient construction of a position an enemy could not profitably attack, the kind of methodical preparation that had made Fredericksburg a slaughterhouse for Union soldiers walking into fire. Longstreet's men had spent days preparing to deliver. Asking that same temperament to execute a rapid offensive assault against a still-forming position was, in effect, asking a general to fight against his own deepest instincts. He complied with the letter of Lee's order. He did not, and by his own nature probably could not comply with its underlying urgency. The fifth mistake was tactical rather than temporal, and it involved how the Echelon assault Lee had ordered was actually executed once it began. The plan called for Hood's division to attack first, followed in sequence by McLaws' division, followed by Richard Anderson's division from A.P. Hill's corps. Each attack beginning as the one before, it engaged the enemy, rolling northward along the Union line like a wave designed to prevent Meade from shifting reserves freely between threatened sectors. In practice, the coordination between these attacking divisions was inconsistent. Hood's assault against the Union, left around Devil's Den and Little Round Top, went in first and fought with tremendous ferocity. But McLaws' attack that was supposed to follow in close sequence lagged behind enough that Union commanders had time to reposition reserves that a tighter sequence might have denied them. Longstreet, as corps commander, bore direct responsibility for the timing and coordination of his own division's attacks, and the gaps between them meant the Confederacy never achieved the cascading pressure the Echelon design was built to produce. The consequence of that broken sequence showed up directly on the battlefield. Union commanders, watching Hood's assault develop against their left, were able to identify it as the primary threat and begin shifting troops from quieter sectors of the line to meet it. And because McLaws' attack did not arrive close enough behind Hood's to prevent that shifting, some of the very reserves Meade moved to reinforce his left ended up available again by the time McLaws' men made contact. An en-echelon assault only works as designed when each wave arrives before the defender has finished responding to the wave before it. Confederate execution on July 2nd gave Meade's headquarters gaps of time between each attacking division large enough to read the battlefield, issue orders, and move men. Precisely the kind of breathing room the entire tactical concept was supposed to deny him. The fighting at Devil's Den and the Boulder Field beneath Little Round Top, some of the most brutal close-quarters combat of the entire battle, illustrates what that broken sequence cost in human terms. Hood's men fought their way through terrain so difficult that formations broke apart entirely. Officers lost contact with entire companies, and the advance degenerated into small groups of soldiers fighting isolated engagements among the rocks without any coordinated command structure directing them. That kind of fragmentation is common in difficult terrain under any circumstances, but it becomes catastrophic when the follow-up assault meant to exploit any breakthrough arrives late enough that Union defenders have already reorganized. Confederate soldiers who briefly seized ground near Little Round Top's southern slope found themselves unsupported when the reinforcement that should have widened the breach failed to arrive on the timetable the entire attack depended on. The sixth mistake involved George Pickett's division, which remained in reserve throughout the second day's fighting, despite being part of Longstreet's own corps and available for commitment. Historians have debated for generations whether inserting Pickett's fresh troops into the July 2nd assault, rather than holding them back for the following day, might have provided the additional weight needed to break the Union line before Meade could fully reinforce it. Longstreet's decision to hold Pickett in reserve reflected standard military doctrine about maintaining a reserve force for exploitation or emergency use, and it was not an unreasonable decision on its own terms. But it meant that the Confederacy's single hardest, most sustained push on July 2nd, the fighting at the wheat field, the peach orchard, and the slopes below Little Round Top, was conducted without roughly 5,000 additional soldiers who spent the day marching and waiting rather than fighting. Whether their presence would have changed the outcome remains genuinely uncertain. What is certain is that Longstreet had troops available that never entered the battle on the day his corps came closest to breaking the Union position. There is also a command culture dimension to this decision that rarely gets discussed. Lee's operational style throughout the war relied heavily on giving his corps commanders broad discretion rather than detailed minute-by-minute instructions, a style that had worked brilliantly with Jackson, who used that discretion aggressively, seeking out opportunities to commit reserves the moment an opening appeared. Longstreet used the same discretion differently, treating it as license to manage his reserve conservatively rather than opportunistically. Neither approach was inherently wrong, but Lee's entire plan for July 2nd assumed a level of aggressive reserve commitment that matched Jackson's habits more than Longstreet's, and Lee never adjusted his expectations to account for the fact that the man executing the plan thought about reserves in fundamentally different terms than the man who had originated the tactical culture Lee was used to relying on. Pickett's men themselves left accounts of what that day of waiting felt like from inside the ranks, and those accounts add something the tactical analysis alone cannot capture. Soldiers who had marched hard to reach Gettysburg spent July 2nd in reserve positions listening to the battle unfold in the distance, hearing the volume of fire rise and fall without knowing what it meant, aware that they were being held back for reasons their officers could not fully explain to them. Some accounts describe a restless frustration among Pickett's men as the day wore on, a sense among soldiers eager to prove themselves that they were being denied the opportunity, while other divisions absorbed the fighting and the casualties. That frustration would matter the following morning when Pickett's fresh, uncommitted division became the natural choice to spearhead the assault Lee ordered for July 3rd, in part precisely because they had not yet been bled by the previous day's fighting, which meant the decision to hold them in reserve on July 2nd directly shaped which troops absorbed the catastrophe of July 3rd. The seventh mistake unfolded on the morning of July 3rd, when Lee informed Longstreet that the assault plan for the day would center on a massive infantry attack against the center of the Union line on Cemetery Ridge, the assault that would become known to history as Pickett's Charge. Longstreet argued against it directly and at length, telling Lee that he had studied war for a long time and did not believe 15,000 men could cross open ground and take a position defended the way the Union Center was defended. This argument was not a mistake in itself. Longstreet's assessment was, by the judgment of most military historians, since essentially correct. The mistake was what happened after Lee overruled him and ordered the attack forward anyway. Longstreet, as the senior corps commander responsible for executing the assault, spent the following hours in a state that multiple witnesses described as visibly reluctant, and that reluctance affected the quality of his command decisions during the final preparation for the attack. A general convinced an assault will fail is still responsible for organizing it as effectively as one who believes in it, and the evidence suggests Longstreet's open pessimism about the plan bled into how thoroughly he managed its execution. Contemporary witnesses left accounts of Longstreet's demeanor that morning that are difficult to read as anything other than a man going through motions he had already concluded were pointless. Colonel Alexander, commanding the artillery that would open the bombardment, later wrote that he found Longstreet's mood that day unlike anything he had seen from him before, subdued, almost detached, in sharp contrast to the decisive energy he had shown in his two previous major engagements. A commander's state of mind is not a minor detail in an operation this complex. Every subordinate officer preparing for the assault took some measure of confidence, or lack of it, from the senior officer overseeing the plan, and Longstreet's visible conviction that the attack would fail was not the kind of signal that improves the odds of an operation succeeding, despite the odds already being long. The eighth mistake concerned the artillery bombardment meant to precede the infantry assault, and it sits squarely within Longstreet's actual area of responsibility rather than in the realm of disputed judgment calls. Approximately 170 Confederate guns opened fire on the Union Center in the early afternoon of July 3rd, intended to destroy Union artillery and disrupt the infantry positions the assault would need to cross before the infantry advance began. The bombardment was, by nearly every account from officers who witnessed it, poorly coordinated. Confederate gunners, unable to see through the smoke that quickly filled the field, overestimated the damage they were inflicting and continued firing based on inaccurate assessments of Union losses. Longstreet held overall authority over his corps' artillery through Colonel Edward Porter Alexander, and the responsibility for ensuring the bombardment achieved its actual objective, silencing Union guns and softening the infantry position, rested with that chain of command. When Alexander sent word that ammunition was running low and that the infantry needed to advance immediately if it was going to advance at all, the bombardment had not accomplished what it needed to accomplish, and the infantry went forward into a Union position substantially more intact than Confederate commanders had led themselves to believe. There is a specific procedural failure buried inside this broader one that deserves attention. Alexander had told Longstreet before the bombardment began that ammunition reserves were limited, and that once the guns began firing, there would be no practical way to pause, reassess accuracy, and resume The bombardment essentially had to work on its first and only attempt. That constraint placed enormous weight on getting the initial fire coordinated correctly, on establishing clear communication between the artillery and the observers, meant to be judging its effect on Union positions. That communication broke down almost immediately once the smoke settled over the field, and neither Longstreet nor his subordinate commanders had built in a reliable method for correcting course once the bombardment was already underway, and the guns could no longer see clearly what they were hitting. Union artillery, meanwhile, had deliberately reduced its own rate of return fire partway through the bombardment, a decision made by Union Artillery Chief Henry Hunt, specifically intended to conserve ammunition for the infantry assault Hunt correctly anticipated would follow, and to convince Confederate observers that Union guns had been more thoroughly disabled than they actually were. Confederate officers watching the reduced Union fire interpreted it as confirmation that the bombardment was succeeding, when in reality, they were being deceived by a more experienced artillery commander who understood exactly what conclusion his silence would produce among the Confederate observers watching from a distance. The ninth mistake is the most controversial one, and it concerns the moment the actual order to advance was given. When Alexander's message arrived asking whether the infantry should move forward, witnesses described Longstreet as unable to answer verbally, responding instead with a silent nod. George Pickett, receiving his final orders to advance from a commander who could not bring himself to voice them, has been described by multiple accounts as reading Longstreet's posture and expression as confirmation before riding off to begin the assault. This moment has been interpreted in dramatically different ways across a century and a half of writing about the battle, as evidence of a commander so overcome by the certainty of catastrophe that he could not speak the order that would send thousands of his men to their deaths, or as a failure of command clarity at the single moment clarity mattered most. Whichever interpretation carries more weight, the practical result was the same. The order that launched one of the most consequential infantry assaults in American military history was communicated at the critical instant without words. Longstreet himself, in his own post-war writing, described the moment with unusual candor for a man defending his own military record. He wrote that he could not, in that instant, bring himself to speak the words that he believed were sending Pickett's division to slaughter. Whatever else can be said about Longstreet's performance across those 3 days, that admission stands apart from the tactical debates about timing and coordination. It is the testimony of a professional soldier acknowledging that his own certainty about an outcome had, for one critical moment, overridden his ability to perform the basic function of command. Pickett advanced anyway. Roughly 12,500 men crossed nearly 3/4 of a mile of open, exposed farmland under sustained artillery and rifle fire, and fewer than half of them made it back to their own lines by the time the assault finally collapsed. Confederate General Lewis Armistead, one of Pickett's brigade commanders, briefly reached the stone wall at the Union Center with his hat raised on his sword before being mortally wounded within feet of the guns his men had come to capture, a moment that became, in the decades after the war, the closest visual shorthand for how near the assault had come to succeeding and how completely it still failed. The silent nod that sent them forward has become, more than any other single image from the battle, the symbol of everything that had accumulated across those 3 days. 9 decisions, each one individually explainable, that together produced a catastrophe none of them were designed in isolation to cause. What happened to Longstreet after the war is its own story, and it is impossible to understand why the 9 mistakes above calcified into a single simplified narrative of slowness without understanding it. Longstreet survived the war, and unlike many former Confederate generals, he did something that much of the post-war South considered close to a betrayal. He supported Reconstruction, accepted a position in the Republican administration of his old friend Ulysses Grant, and publicly criticized aspects of the Confederate cause he had spent 4 years fighting for. That set of choices made Longstreet deeply unpopular among former Confederates and among the Southern writers who spent the following decades constructing what historians now call the lost cause narrative. an interpretation of the war that painted the Confederacy's defeat as inevitable given Union material advantages, protected Robert E. Lee's reputation as something close to infallible, and needed an explanation for Gettysburg specifically that did not place responsibility on Lee himself. Longstreet, already politically unpopular and already on record as having argued against the July 3rd assault before it happened, became the most convenient answer available. Former Confederate officers and lost cause writers, particularly in the decades following Lee's death in 1870, built an interpretation of Gettysburg that concentrated blame for the defeat overwhelmingly on Longstreet's supposed slowness on July 2nd, often exaggerating the extent and significance of that delay well beyond what the actual military record supported. Jubal Early, a former Confederate general who became one of the most influential architects of lost cause history, wrote extensively and specifically about Longstreet's failures at Gettysburg in ways that shaped public understanding of the battle for generations, long after most participants who could have corrected the record were dead. This matters for understanding the 9 mistakes described here, because it means the actual historical record and the popular memory of Longstreet at Gettysburg diverged sharply, and the popular memory won for the better part of a century. Early delivered a series of widely publicized speeches and articles in the 1870s, specifically targeting Longstreet's conduct at Gettysburg, timed in part as a response to Longstreet's own post-war political choices, and those speeches became foundational texts for how generations of Southern readers understood the battle. William Nelson Pendleton, Lee's former chief of artillery, joined Early in promoting the narrative that Longstreet had disobeyed or willfully delayed Lee's orders on July 2nd, despite Pendleton's own wartime correspondence containing no such accusation at the time the events actually occurred. The gap between what these men wrote during the war and what they wrote about the same events a decade or more later is itself one of the clearest pieces of evidence that the lost cause version of Longstreet's performance was constructed retrospectively, shaped by post-war political grievance rather than contemporaneous military assessment. The real decisions, the argument on July 1st, the Wait for Law's Brigade, the Countermarch, the delayed launch, the uneven on-echelon coordination, the reserve held back, the visible reluctance on July 3rd, the poorly managed bombardment, the silent order, are more specific, more human, and considerably more defensible in isolation than the caricature of a sulking general who simply refused to fight. Longstreet made real errors across those 3 days. Nearly every general at Gettysburg did, on both sides. What separates Longstreet's case from most of the others is that his errors were absorbed into a political and cultural project that needed a villain, and he was available. Modern military historians, working without the post-war political pressures that shaped the earliest accounts of the battle, have largely revised the harshest judgments of Longstreet's performance. His assessment that Pickett's charge would fail has been vindicated by nearly every subsequent tactical analysis of the ground and the forces involved. His preference for defensive positioning on July 1st has aged well, given what actually happened when the Confederacy attacked instead. What remains once the lost cause distortions are stripped away is a more precise and more interesting picture. A genuinely skilled general, operating at the edge of his particular strengths, making a series of individually reasonable decisions under conditions of exhaustion, incomplete information, and command friction with a superior whose plan he did not believe in. Decisions that compounded, hour by hour, into the worst defeat the Army of Northern Virginia would suffer in its history. There is one more piece of this story that rarely makes it into the popular retellings, and it happened within minutes of Pickett's survivors stumbling back across the field they had just crossed. Lee rode out to meet them, and by nearly every account from soldiers who witnessed it, he did not look for anyone to blame. He told the returning men repeatedly that the failure was his and his alone, that he had asked more of them than any soldiers could have delivered, and that the fault belonged entirely to their commanding general. Longstreet, watching this, later wrote that Lee's composure and his refusal to assign blame in that moment represented one of the most remarkable displays of character he witnessed in 4 years of war. Whatever disagreements existed between the two men about how the battle should have been fought, Lee's public accounting of responsibility in the immediate aftermath was unambiguous, and it stands in direct contrast to the version of events that Lost Cause writers would construct in the decades that followed. Once Lee himself was no longer alive to correct the record they were building around his name. The working relationship between Lee and Longstreet, notably, survived Gettysburg largely intact. Longstreet continued to command Lee's First Corps for the remainder of the war, fought at the Wilderness the following spring where he was seriously wounded by friendly fire in circumstances eerily similar to Jackson's death a year earlier, and remained in Lee's confidence through the final campaigns of the war. Whatever tension existed between the two men over the events of July 2nd and July 3rd, 1863, it did not manifest in any lasting professional rupture during the war itself. That detail matters because it suggests that Lee, who understood better than anyone exactly what had gone wrong at Gettysburg, did not view Longstreet's performance there as a fundamental failure of leadership requiring a change in command. He viewed it, apparently, the way military historians largely view it today, as a series of specific, explicable decisions made by a competent general under difficult conditions, rather than evidence of a fatal character flaw that had somehow gone undetected through 2 years of otherwise exceptional service. It is worth asking, finally, what the battle might have looked like if even a handful of these 9 decisions had gone differently, not to relitigate the Civil War, but to understand why these particular moments have held historians' attention for so long after the guns went silent. If Longstreet had launched his assault at 10 in the morning instead of 4 in the afternoon, against a Union left flank still in its original configuration, rather than the reinforced salient Sickles had created, the brutal close fighting that consumed the Wheatfield and Devil's Den might have unfolded against a considerably weaker defensive position. If the Echelon sequence had maintained tighter coordination between Hood's and McLaws' divisions, Meade's headquarters might never have had the window it used to shift reserves as effectively as it did. If Pickett's division had gone in fresh on July 2nd, rather than waiting for July 3rd, the Confederacy's hardest push of the entire battle might have carried 5,000 additional soldiers who instead spent that day marching and waiting. None of these counterfactuals guarantee a different outcome. War rarely rewards clean hypotheticals, and Meade's army held real advantages of position and numbers that no single tactical adjustment would have fully erased. But each of these 9 decisions represents a point where the battle's actual trajectory diverged from a plausible alternative. And it is precisely that density of consequential choices compressed into 3 days and centered on one general that makes Longstreet's performance at Gettysburg one of the most thoroughly examined command records in American military history. That is the story. The single word slow was always too small to hold. 9 decisions made by a genuinely capable general under conditions that would have tested any commander in either army, compounding hour by hour into a defeat the Confederacy never fully recovered from, and then flattened by history into a caricature that took 150 years to begin correcting.